Hello again, my lovelies, and welcome back to the channel. Once again, it is time for Child of the Sea and Saviour of the Stars. As this is the third chapter in a recording session, nothing significant has happened since then. There are no trigger warnings right now, except for the canon-typical ones regarding Project Hail Mary and Percy Jackson. With that, grab yourself something to drink, grab a snack, sit back and relax. And I hope you go check out the link in the descriptions for both Lily the Cat Lily Cat Person on TikTok and chevsolo for AO3. With that, how about we go right into the video? Child of the Sea, Saviour of the Stars. An idea by Lily Cat Person on TikTok. Written by chevsolo on AO3. Read by Tilir. Chapter 3. Dr. Grace? So he was handling this well. If by well meant being on the third IV bag of vodka he'd found with Ilyuchna Sphinx and dancing in the newly dubbed Don't Go Crazy room with a mop wearing a dress, then yeah, he was handling this great. It could be worse. Anyway, something told him he was actually handling this situation a lot better than something else. Something on the edge of his awareness, locked up neatly with the rest of his memory. So yeah, he was doing pretty well, being the only living person on a spaceship nearly 12 light years from home. With no way back as well. Something he knew for a depressing fact now, after he'd accepted the fact that he was in an entirely different solar system. He'd immediately started working on the math. According to the ship's logs, they were almost out of fuel, so a return journey home at the same speed at which he'd been brought to that system, which he calculated was near to light speed as humans could possibly get to, was impossible, at least in his lifetime. So he was stuck, left out to die among the stars, alone. He had maybe a couple of years' worth of food left. The ship was slowly working him up to solids after years on coma slurry, but he'd gotten a glimpse of both the solids supply and the coma slurry. So he could make it last a couple of years, maybe a couple more. Obviously, it was never meant to last that long with a crew of 3, but now down to 1, he had plenty. So whoever had orchestrated this mission had anticipated it taking only a few months at most. If they packed enough for 3 to last maybe half a year. If they stretched it enough to avoid malnutrition. Whether that was because they knew roughly what they were supposed to be looking for, or to give them an incentive to move as quickly as they could. And hey, he'd also had another memory return while he was doing the math. He knew that he'd found out about the Petrova line, just like everyone else. Tiny little black space dots that were maybe eating the sun. And now he knew that he was a school teacher, which was great because the more he'd thought about being a single, lonely man in his 30s who didn't have kids but loved kids, it started to get more than a little worried, but a school teacher, that was way better than he feared. It seemed to fit with him, but it didn't explain why a middle school science teacher was in space. Admittedly, he was a little too drunk to care to find out at the moment. Mary didn't seem to notice that that her soul companion was dealing with diminished capabilities, but she also seemed to be running by herself. So she didn't need to worry about her only occupant crashing them into a star or something. She just kept him fed and on a roughly 24-hour schedule, probably to introduce some level of normalcy since there was no night and day in space, unless he started spinning the ship on the same rotation as the Earth. They were close enough to whatever star they were heading to where they got its light, but he didn't know how or if it would tear the ship apart, so he stuck with falling apart with Russian grade alcohol on hand. Which was some strong stuff. Really strong, but either he had a hell of a metabolism or he was used to something stronger because he felt like he wasn't as drunk as he could have been. Ilyuch now packed a surprising amount of alcohol. And heroin? But it wasn't infinite, so Grace opted to blow through it out. Grace opted not to blow through it all. Heck, maybe he'd switch to heroin just to have something different. Had he done heroin before? He didn't know. Maybe he'd find out. How pathetic was he, though? Here he was on a spaceship, obviously meant to figure out what was going on with their son, or how to stop it, and he was slumped on the grated floor, drunk as a skunk. Some savior he was. How'd he even get involved anyway? Surely there was something else. Someone better. Someone who wouldn't be half unconscious on the floor by this point. Letting his head thump back against the wall, he pressed his palms against his eyes as the pounding in his head picked up. Whether it was from the alcohol or the emerging memory, he didn't know. Only that it hurt like heck. San Francisco, California, some years prior. He'd sat staring at the solar system he'd painstakingly crafted years ago, long after the final bell rang and his students poured out of the classroom, eager to go home for the day. Ryland knew he'd likely be getting some phone calls or emails from parents later, both those who'd rather keep their heads and their children's head buried in the sands, and those who wanted to better help explain the situation to their children. He'd done his best to mitigate the growing fear in his kids today, but kids were resilient and had no real understanding of just how grave this situation was. Some did. Sure, Olivia, he could tell, hadn't been able to shake her uncertainty for the rest of the period. She was a smart one, reminded him so much of Annabeth. It hurt. Gods, what was going to happen to them? 30 years may seem like nothing, but it was their entire future, which they won't have. And if they have kids, they'd have to watch them suffer too. It wasn't fair. It was terrifying. And it almost made him want to go back there to demand answers. The door to his classroom opening dragged him away from that line of thought. It'd be too dangerous, and he knew that, but honestly, he'd do anything for his kids. Ryland gathered up assignments and his notebooks where he kept lesson plans as he kept the woman in the corner of his eye. She wasn't a parent, he knew. Maybe an aunt, a dad's girlfriend, new student coming in. She didn't seem like she was out of place. In fact, she seemed like a woman on a mission. Knock, knock. Okay. Interesting accent. Dutch? German? Definitely not one of his students' relatives, unless they were hiding something from him. Who's there? He responded, only half paying attention to Parker's sloppy handwriting, now as he flipped through his chemistry homework. She seemed almost resigned, less defeated and more impatient. Well, that's no fun. Not good at jokes, she responded, obviously hoping that he would drop the act and let her get to the point. Clearly, she didn't know who she was dealing with now. Not good at jokes, who? He retorted with a laugh at his own dumb joke. He won't call it dumb, but Annabeth would. He hoped the silence that followed wouldn't be suspicious or weird to the woman. It was getting easier to remember her, but it would never fully heal. The pain, the loss. At least sometimes now. He could think of her and smile. That was progress. Progress that only took a decade to achieve, but progress nonetheless. If she caught on, she didn't say anything, just cut straight to the point. Dr. Grace? And wow, what a point it was! He paused, shocked, and stared at her for a moment, expression hardening. No one had called him that in years. His co-workers knew, the principal knew, but at the school he'd always preferred Mr. Grace. It was easier that way, so he didn't have to rehash the story of how someone with his qualifications ended up teaching middle school science. That wasn't to say it wasn't a rewarding or noble profession, or that other doctorates didn't follow his roots either. But not many of them got fired from their other profession for having a different opinion. He could deny it, brush her off, and go about his day. Anyone asking for Dr. Grace clearly had a can of worms he didn't want to open. He'd later one day wish he'd followed his gut instincts instead of what he went with next. Maybe. Who's asking? He could go full New Yorker on her, but he doubted even a Californian native would understand. Never mind a European. The woman didn't seem moved. She clearly knew who he was and sought him out specifically, but why? Eva Strat, I am with the Petrova Task Force and I need your help. Clearly he heard her wrong. What was going on? Me? He asked, dumbfounded at his stack of paper and notebooks. Fell slightly onto his lap. What was a Petrova Task Force? Obviously the name suggested that they were the world's governments that had gathered to figure out the space dot situation, but what were they really up to and why were they coming to him? Did you write this? Strat asked, bypassing his confusion, and pulled out a bound document. As she turned it around, his stomach simultaneously flipped and dropped. His dissertation, the one that made him the laughingstock of the scientific community as a whole, was staring back at him. Oh. That couldn't possibly be the reason she was there. But it was, and she just kept going. I'm interested in this section that you wrote here, page 31. The Goldilocks zone is for idiots, why everyone else is wrong about life. Standing, Ryland Grace broke out of his stupor to start packing. He had a sinking feeling and he was following it. Dang it! He needed out of there before he ended up blindfolded in the back of some car or something. Listen, that was a long time ago. I don't do that anymore, Strat interrupted him swiftly. Do you stand by what you wrote? Frustration hit him, as it did every time he thought about that paper. A paper he put his heart and soul into on a topic he'd been thinking about since long before he became a scholar. It was the whole reason he chose the field he went into, and it ended horribly. Not as horribly as other things he'd done, but still, it was a blow that stung, and he didn't like bringing it up. I was fired for standing by what I wrote. He responded a little more bitterly than he'd intended, but hey, he started this. She looked at him with the same "don't bullshit me" look that Talia would give him as she packed away his greatest shame. You were fired for calling the leading scholar in your field a staggering waste of carbon at the UNESCO conference in Denmark. Oh, wow, she really did her homework on him. You heard about that, huh? He asked, slightly cowed by her, as he kept packing. Then again, he was sure many people who weren't there had heard about it, just as he was sure that his paper was either ignored or laughed at. It was a rather spectacular display of his temper, one many of his colleagues now couldn't reconcile with the man they knew. He'd mellowed out over the years, dealing with the world's greatest rage baiters, also known as middle schoolers, had that effect on him, and age, but mostly the kids trying his patience, and their parents sometimes. Look, I don't know what this is. He started packing his bag as quickly as he could without making too big a deal out of it. Strat seemed to be only half paying attention to him, like she'd already made her mind up about something and was letting him air out his thoughts. Kinda like someone else he knew. He had red hair too, and if he wasn't as unsettled as he already was, he might have tried calling her out on it. But, I don't think I'm. That's lava. Strat had picked up one of his beanbags, the one shaped like Earth, and looked at him perplexed. No, it's not. Wow, she really couldn't take a joke. Not that he was in the mood to explain how a beanbag could be lava anyway. Okay, he responded, pausing briefly at her bluntness, but he was finished grabbing his stuff and his raincoat. Ryland slipped past her and made his escape, or tried to, as Strat stayed hot on his heels. Sighing, he wove his way through the remaining crowd of students getting their things as he headed to the south entrance where he kept his bike. I don't know what this is, what you want, or why my paper has anything to do with this, but you've got the wrong guy here. She was persistent, he'd give her that. No one in your field wants anything to do with you because you refused to back down from a very unpopular view. No shot, lady! Why do you think I'm not some world-renowned scientist by this point? And I can give you a chance to prove them all wrong. Okay, now, what's this? He was still uncertain, still ready to get out of there, but she managed to get his attention long enough to stall. Setting his bag down by his bike, Ryland still kept going like he was leaving. Just because she said something interesting doesn't mean he was getting involved. Kevin, no running. I'm not, the young boy responded, unamused as he walked behind Ryland and Strat. Once the bright yellow jacket was on, Ryland turned back to Strat with his hands on his hips. Well, joke's on them because I don't even care, so... And he didn't, or at least he told himself he didn't. Strat seemed to pick up on that, darn her. I think you do care, she responded softly, watching him get back to his routine of leaving. A black car parked some ways behind her, and Grace was unaware of the other black car that was pulling up behind him as they spoke. He really needed to improve his situational awareness. He'd fallen behind on it in recent years. Not having to constantly worry about his safety for once made him soft. You're running away because you're scared. He scoffed, glaring slightly at her, even if she was right in a sense. I'm not running away. I just don't want to deal with any of it anymore. That's why I'm where I am now. Grace wanted to shout it, but kept it in to avoid making a scene. Pulling out the key to his bike lock, Grace turned away from Strat. But Strat wasn't going to back down. Do you still believe that water is unnecessary for life? A snort almost left him. It was a hell of a take for him, of all people to have, but it was one that he did stand by. Look, there's nothing magical about hydrogen and oxygen. Water is required for life on Earth, but that's not to say that completely different planets wouldn't have completely different conditions. I don't know why that makes me such a nut. It was something he and Annabeth had talked about before. He was the one to bring it up during a conversation about life outside of Earth. They'd gotten into a debate over it, but he'd made some valid points. Points he explored in his paper that were laughed at. He just didn't think that they should narrow themselves down to water as the basis for life. For all life. Potential or probable. He knew better than most how important it was on Earth, but they didn't hold the monopoly on life. I need you to come with us, Stretch said in response. Us? Oh, hello, intimidating guy in a black suit. Where'd you come from? Now he noticed all the black SUVs around them, with more suited men inside them. He was really about to get kidnapped, wasn't he? Despite knowing he was okay, they had no reason to believe he was anything other than a middle school science teacher. So play it cool, Ryland. Sorry, I didn't get your name, he asked the guy who joined them, holding a handout that went ignored. Well, that was rude. At least the guy didn't blow him off completely, and he had a name for a bodyguard-looking dude, number 1. Carl. Okay, Carl, don't shake my hand then. Strat was an impatient woman. He was quickly coming to learn as she interrupted his introduction with Carl. Dr. Grace Petrova samples splashed down last night. I want you to take a look at them and tell me what they are, how they work. Okay, back on this. I'm a teacher at Grover Cleveland Middle, and I haven't been in academia for years. And you have a doctorate in molecular biology. And I ride a bike to work, and it's not for the exercise. Placing his helmet on for emphasis, Ryland used the motions of going to unlock his bike as an excuse to map out his surroundings. 3 cars, each carrying 2 to 3 men. Most of them were still in their cars, so he could get away if he needed. He knew the area and they couldn't catch a bike in San Francisco traffic. I'm sure there are thousands of other scientists more qualified than I am. It survives on the surface of the sun. Strat sighed, voice strained as she tilted her head in a way that was very like what I'm hearing now. Does that sound like a water-based life form to you? And he was. Okay, color him intrigued. On the surface of the sun, you say, strange lady. Water would evaporate before it even got near the sun. Any water-based life forms would burn up in a crisp. Surviving on the surface? It'd have to be a massive water-based life form. With high heat tolerance and water supply. Those dots he saw couldn't be bigger than the average cell. No way it could be water-based then. Were these little dots really about to prove his theory correct? He was ashamed to say he folded rather quickly after that, locking his bike and helmet back up. They didn't have the means to bring it with them, and Strat promised they'd drop him off back at the school to pick it up once they were done with him. It'd be all right. The students were generally well-behaved and wouldn't vandalize or steal it. They didn't get any vagrants passing through either. Ryland didn't get into the cars quickly, though. The gravity of the situation had started to settle on his shoulders as he locked up his bike and let one of the goon squad members take his backpack. He looked at Carl as the man stepped up next to him, almost looking a little sick at the thought. The sun's really dying. Carl's response was a sad certainty. Yeah. Okay, so this was really happening. There was a real threat to the world, to his kids. As Ryland got into the car, he wondered how they would handle this, if he'd even be made privy to it. He'd do his best with whatever they needed of him, and hope it was enough to at least keep him in the loop. As the world flew past them, Ryland had more than half turned back the thoughts of going back there to find answers. If the sun was dying, he knew of at least 2 people who were being directly impacted by it. That made him wonder, was it extraterrestrial? Was it something else? Whatever it was, the mortal world was not aware, so it was big, really big. Probably bigger than he realized. Not that the sun was dying wasn't already a big enough thing, but still, it left him with one question he didn't know how he'd get the answers to without exposing himself. What were the gods doing about this?